Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 5th, 1960, British critic Kenneth Tynan is called before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee and questioned about his views on Cuba, communism, and other matters. Tynan had recently produced a TV program featuring countercultural voices in America, and he'd long had Soviet-sympathetic politics. Suffice it to say, Tynan didn't love having to testify. In part, he wondered why a British citizen was being called before a U.S. subcommittee, but this was a key moment and an instructive one in the swirl between culture and politics, the Cold War and propaganda in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And that swirl is the subject of a new series from our Radiotopia pal Benjamen Walker, host of Theory of Everything, master of the wide-ranging and rabbit-hole-filled audio documentary. He's got this new series. It's called Not All Propaganda is Art. It looks at the way in which culture came crashing into the Cold War. And a lot of that culture was funded by the CIA, mind you. It profiles a number of key figures in that story, including Kenneth Tynan. So, Ben Walker, welcome to the show and congrats on the new series. I'm really glad you're here to talk about it.
Oh, it's so great to be with you all. I couldn't imagine more folks I'd want to talk about this with. So thanks for having me on the show.
And when you say folks, you're referring to, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I have taken to calling Ben Walker the Adam Curtis of podcasting, basically, if that makes sense to people, but, sweeping and epic and full of these rabbit holes and trying to pull in all the different strands. And so I will say it's a 9-part series, right, folks?
Yeah.
We're not going to cover all of that. I think there's a few things I want to hone in on here. And in particular, I think 2 things that you add really important complexity to over the course of this series. So one is just an understanding of what exactly the politics between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the Cold War are in the late 50s. And then I think it's funny, we have this idea and this notion, it's almost sort of taken as a given that, the CIA funded art, and I mean, that's almost like not a sort of interesting fact anymore. That's sort of been told. And then you come in and you, I think, complexify that even more and say, well, there's a lot of nuance in there. And so we'll build to understanding what you really came to understand about how the CIA funded that. But do you want to jump in on any of that?
Yeah, I want to back up to that because I think that for me is one of the reasons I wanted to do this series. I think when you look back to Frances Stoner Saunders' groundbreaking book from 2000, The Cultural Cold War, in which she kind of sort of broke open the door on this story about, even though the truth came out in 1967 about the CIA's funding of culture, her book was really the one that sort of opened the door on the story, including the one about abstract expressionism. But this argument that the CIA funded culture, therefore this is bad, I find not a very compelling argument. Mm-hmm. In other words, what did the CIA do? That was the question I've been waiting since that book came out for someone to answer. It's just, I have my feelings about the CIA, just like probably other people do as well. But it's just to say that, okay, this is bad. It's just not enough of an argument. And so I always was much more interested in what did they get for their money? What did they do? And so I decided to focus on 3 writers who got caught up in this. And they are the novelist Richard Wright, who at this time was living in Paris in exile in protest of American racism, an American cultural critic, a little magazine writer named Dwight MacDonald, and then a British writer named Kenneth Tynan, who was in London for the first 2 years working at the London Observer as a theater critic, and then came to America and worked at the New Yorker the last 2 years, 58 to 60. And during this time, he makes this documentary about American dissent and nonconformism for British television for him, a way of pushing back on anti-Americanism in the UK, but interpreted here in the US by Senator Dodd, who subpoenas him, as an anti-American documentary.
So interesting to point out that moment in 1967 when these discoveries are first being made, because of course that colors how people think about and remember the expose and why there are such negative views toward it. I mean, it is the start of a period of years, a decade in which all of the bad acts of the CIA are being exposed. We did a series with historian Rick Perlstein about the family jewels and the assassination attempts and all of those different things. And so this gets caught up in the criticism of the overreach of the intelligence communities and the lies of the federal government. And it's wonderful to be able to take a step back now and say, well, but what was it other than just an expression of U.S. imperialism? Like, what was actually happening?
Absolutely. And I think that, also it's bookended by two very, very big stories, which are the Hungarian uprising in the fall of 1956 and then the Congo crisis in 1960. And so, and the CIA was very much involved in both of those stories. And I feel that, and there's a big chain, that those are also, those two events have global repercussions, especially on culture.
Yeah.
So let's actually just go a little further on that question of what exactly the role of the CIA was. This question you ask, what are they actually getting for it? I mean, one of the really interesting, provocative things you point out in the series is, and I don't know whether you believe it or not, but some of the people who were, for all intents and purposes, on the CIA payroll claimed that they may not have even known, or certainly claimed that it didn't really affect their work. So, I mean, how were people navigating the idea that some of the funding for, important cultural work was coming from...
This is a question I feel the first generation of scholars that have kind of looked at this, and a lot of stuff that's been read, including the book I mentioned earlier. This is a real fundamental question: who knew and who didn't know. I also think that's not a very interesting question, or definitely not a very helpful question. And that's why I love that Kenneth Tynan knew. He absolutely knew. I think Dwight McDonald, who joins the Encounter staff in 1956 after writing the first sort of the only big journalism piece, a 3-part New Yorker article on the Ford Foundation in 1955. Of course, he was very aware of the foundation support and its connection to the U.S. government that was coming. And even, with Richard Wright, in 1960, he becomes very aware and sort of angry about the CIA's involvement. But in 1956, he was very aware. Like, they funded him to go to the Bandung Conference in 1955, the same magazine. But for him, I see his anger more at the end of his life was more about kind of recognizing that the little support he got was more about containing him than it was supporting him. And I find that, and I think the same thing goes for Dwight McDonald, who, set out in 1955 to write a critique of American mass culture. And for the CIA, this was, like danger sign number one, because the critique of American mass culture translated too easily into a critique of American culture from European cultural expression. They looked at the sort of American mass culture as crass, consumerist, and low culture, and was threatening European culture. So it was one of the things that they were afraid about of America. And so the idea that this guy who had a big book contract to write the book on the critique of American mass culture is the same guy they hire in 1956 is just something that scholars have not really dealt with, that sort of aspect of the Dwight McDonald story. It's very much containment as well.
So, I mean, Kelly and Nikki, you're scholars, right? And you deal with the history of politics and culture. I mean, how do you encounter a moment like this where you realize, like, oh, this is all wrapped up together? There is government funding here in the artists. I mean, does it inherently compromise the work in the way that I think some people might think, or how do you?
So there's two things that I think about when I think about this moment. One, I think about the abolitionist movement, because that's my expertise. But I think about like how certain white abolitionists were like patrons of like these slave narratives, and how they sort of curated what could be sort of said or not said within, these narratives. I think about it in the Harlem Renaissance, how you also had these like white patrons that would sort of, commission certain work to be done by Black authors or poets. And then it's sort of like, is this Langston Hughes or is this his patron? I think even when it comes to Richard Wright, thinking about what the outcome of the writing is, like how are audiences engaging with the work that he is creating? Does it have the impact that the CIA wants it to have? I think the same thing with Malcolm X and Alex Haley. He's working with the FBI for his autobiography of Malcolm X, and Alex Haley's trying to write it to be a cautionary tale, but people are not necessarily perceiving Malcolm X autobiography in that way. So I think my larger question is just sort of like, not just what is the art or what is the product that is being curated, but how is it being received by the people that are actually engaging with that work?
Absolutely. And I feel that the main story for Richard Wright between this period is, of course, everybody's protest novel with James Baldwin. Even though that is first written in 1949 in a small Paris magazine, it's really when it's published in the book Notes of a Native Son, which comes out in January of 1956. This is the one that, where it gets an actually wide audience. And that book is published by Solstein through Beacon Press, which is part of this CIA-funded effort. And James Baldwin is absolutely aware of this. And some of the letters that you can find that are in the Yale archive, he's very, very much aware of what the Congress for Cultural Freedom represents and what it is. And, the book was not even his idea. The book was Solstein's idea to publish this book. And it comes at a moment when Richard Wright is becoming more and more recognizing that, the people even though he's sort of working as a sort of a prominent member of the anti-communist left for the Congress for Cultural Freedom at this moment, he's still being attacked by forces he feels that are still, just as he puts it, the very fact that he's sort of living free in Paris, as he writes, seeing that there's more freedom in one square block of Paris than there is in all of the United States at this point. It's just the very existence of him not wanting to live in America gets translated into him being an anti-American writer.
Interested in the forces shaping our world? The Council on Foreign Relations has you covered. For those who like to look ahead, dive into The World Next Week, hosted by Bob McMahon and Carla Ann Robbins.
We were not forecasting anything about Russian domestic upheaval, and yet that has been the story of the week.
These are scorpions going after each other in a bottle.
And for those who want to go beyond the headlines, join Jim Lindsay as he opens up the president's inbox.
What should U.S. policy do?
The approach towards China, it's enough to make me question bipartisanship.
And finally, join me, Gabrielle Sierra, on Why It Matters, as my guests and I bring some of the world's most compelling stories home to you.
Do you feel good about where we're heading with AI?
Maybe we need to invent a new word here, which kind of is a combination of frightened and excited. I'm excited.
So what are you waiting for?
For the world next week, the president's inbox.
And Why It Matters. We'll see you soon.
And I think that tension is so interesting because much of what the CIA is trying to do in this period is to portray the United States as a place where freedom has led to all of this incredible art. And so they're putting forward and supporting Black artists, including people like Louis Armstrong. And that idea that you're now going to be the avatar for how good, quote unquote, race relations are in the United States in the 1950s, I would imagine is offensive to some of the artists who are being used
couldn't even stay in a hotel where he's performing. I mean, it's crazy.
So that gap between the ostensible message and the experience of the people who are being promoted by the CIA, that becomes a point of conflict, of course. But, there's also, I think, opportunity for artists to, yes, you're taking this money, you have this kind of attachment to the CIA and to the government, but that doesn't mean that the government controls you, right? That there's still space and agency for these artists, not just for audiences to take something different from the art, as Kelly was talking about, but for the artists to also shape their message and their art. Although I think it's you also have to take into consideration what you were saying, Ben, about the way that the government then constrains the art that is coming out.
Or just maybe to boil it down is that the American government was pushing back on anti-Americanism. The goal was to fight anti-Americanism in Europe. And for someone like Dwight MacDonald, who really believed that the crass, bad American mass culture was a threat to American society as well, he did not see his comments as sort of, on the other side. He saw himself as trying to win the Cold War and sending this message that we need to find ways for American artists and American culture to thrive, even in this highly commercialized world of mass culture. That was his argument. And the same thing with Kenneth Tynan, who loved America. Kenneth Tynan made this documentary about American nonconformists and dissenters in 1960 because he loved America and he wanted to highlight, he wanted to project some images of America that he thought were important and special and highlighted what was great about America. And when Senator Dodd and other American Cold Warriors blew their tops, is that they saw this expression as illegitimate dissent, as illegitimate protest, as illegitimate nonconformism, and offensive to America's proud tradition of legitimate dissent, as he put it in the courtroom. And I find that so fascinating that like these artists, so that, this question about this tension for me really boils down more to, especially in the cases of all three of them, all three of these incredible writers, they were trying to talk about what they thought was great about America, or at least was great about the West, and maybe in Richard Wright's example. And they were all sort of still that they did not fit with the American projection of what they wanted to project about, when it came to America's race issues, when it came to America's artistic issues and America's cultural plans.
I think that is a really good way to get to this other thing that you do in the series really effectively, and it's important to point out, which is sort of paint the many competing and swirling political factions at this moment. Because, I think we've tried to do it on our show whenever we talk about the Cold War, but I think, there's this idea that it's like the Cold War is like it's like a boxing match, and you have two fighters in opposite corners, and they come in and they just basically fight for 30 years. And it's actually much more like, it's like a dance or something, and sometimes they're not even doing the same kind of dance, but it's like constantly swirling and moving, and there's different like threads and sub-threads. And so I'm curious what you learned about, this particular window, 1956 to 1960, from a Cold War perspective. I mean, you just mentioned it, but there's anti-Americanism, anti-communism, anti-communism. There's the notion of appeasement and a sort of detente, and then there's anti-that. I mean, it is so nuanced, and I think you can't understand the sort of cultural product without understanding that.
And I feel that, one of the differences perhaps doing a podcast versus, reading a scholarly book is that you can make these arguments, it's really hard to do this in audio, basically, saying that, okay, we're going to talk about anti-communism and the anti-communist. It's like people are just going to turn that off.
What are we against? What are we fighting for?
Yeah. But whereas the anti-Americanism really makes sense. So in other words, like there were anti-American propagandists. That's really what was going on. And for someone who loved America, it was really easy to sign up for anti-American propaganda because you were basically pushing back on something. And then
being anti-American didn't mean you were pro-communist. I mean, I think that's the important underlining thing. Yes.
Exactly. And I think that for Kenneth Tynan, sort of showcasing that these younger generation of beat poets and subversive comedians, and even I think one of the things that upset Senator Dodd the most was that he had a guy from a society called the Mattachine Society, a guy named Harold Call, who was a very early advocate for homosexual rights in America. And so Kenneth Tynan put this guy in the film. And, the Americans lost their mind over this, that this is not what America represents. But, for Kenneth Tynan, he really saw, in the UK had similar problems, but this sort of, persecution of homosexuals was something that he saw more in line with totalitarianism.
That tension between definitions of pluralism, like what does it mean to be a pluralistic society? Does it include somebody from the Mattachine Society or not?
Yeah.
And legitimate protest. I mean, these seem to be the dividing lines of the Cold War era, and it plays out in the Black civil rights struggle. It plays out in the college protests in the 1960s and 1970s, but it's also just this core political schism of where you draw the lines around that. Because I think that in many cases, two sides that are fiercely fighting over legitimate protests, legitimate forms of dissent, both think that they're defending this proud tradition of dissent in the United States and this proud tradition of pluralism, but they come down so differently on what that means that they end up at loggerheads with one another.
Absolutely. And I think for me, just as an individual creative person growing up, I've always sided with cultural protest being effective. I think that in the back of my mind, the idea that cultural protest can have just as much effect on the world and change the world, I mean, that's in my core being. Like, I really, truly believe in that. But I feel that after spending so much time in this period and sort of seeing the cultural turn, I feel that one of the things Kenneth Tynan comes away with in 1960 is that the limitations of this are sort of individual dissent. In other words, the cultural turn turns inward. In other words, politics really is about a movement and people coming together to affect change. And there's something about the cultural turn of the late 1950s, which really leads individuals to be protesting through their own individualized, atomized experience. And that might be more limited than some of the individuals who saw promise in this argument at this moment really believed at the beginning. That's one of the things I came away with this, especially with Kenneth Tynan being hauled before Senator Dodd's Senate committee, which, we should point out is basically the equivalent of the more famous House of Un-American activities at this period, and being sort of chastised and attacked for trying to write this love letter to what he loved about America, and being told there's legitimate and illegitimate dissent. I think he kind of came away with that, America was starting to turn inwards rather than sort of looking at like what culture and society, which are, by definition, larger entities than the individual, and sort of legitimate dissent meant individual dissent, and that I found really kind of mind blowing. I never really thought of cultural and social protest as limiting as I do after doing this project.
So I have to ask as we wrap up. I mean, does that change you now? I mean, are you looking at the world and looking at art now in a different way, understanding what you have come to understand by making this series?
Interesting. Yeah, I would say so. And I think we're living through that, as we're looking at the world at this moment, when we're seeing so much protest, right at this moment being called illegitimate or there's something about the very nature of politics that that I think art and culture can sort of tap into, but I think that it's definitely not a turn inwards.
All right, well, listen, the series, 9 parts, it's all out now, right? People can go binge it. Are people doing that, Ben? Are they binging, or how do you find
I hope so. I mean, it's more of an audiobook. I mean, I have to say, like, I've sent so many emails out and to journalists, and they're like, well, we don't really write about podcasts. So now I feel I can call it an audiobook.
Yeah.
No, I agree. And, Kelly and Nikki will appreciate you spent, 4 years working on this? You were deep in the archives. You were traveling the world, finding the boxes of tapes. So, yes, you did the work of a book.
It's so richly done, and it's a nice slow burn. It's great.
Yeah. The last episode, I actually have audio of Richard Wright's final speech, which he gives before his death. And the part where he talks about James Baldwin was cut from the tape.
Wow.
All right. Well, the series is called Not All Propaganda is Art. It is in the feed for Ben's ongoing Radiotopia show, Theory of Everything. So you can go listen to that series. And then if you are new to the work of Ben Walker, you can go listen to the years and years of brilliant work sitting there for you. But Ben, congrats again, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.